Hi, it's Helen Tarrant. Welcome to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. You're here with Helen Tarrant, and today I'm actually going to talk about what it's like when you have to swap out a tenant. This is the beginning of 2021, and you just never know that you might be buying a property and you're looking at a property for uplift. If you're looking at a property for uplift, or you're buying a property where there's a narrow window where you are actually going to get some gains out of this property in terms of equity and growth and also cash flow by swapping out an underperforming tenant with a new tenant. What is that going to require and what is that like? So let's start out from the beginning. If you were buying a property and you have a tenant that's paying under market rent, that's not a big deal if you know that within a short space of time, whether it's 6 months, 9 months or 12 months, you're going to be swapping out that tenant with someone that's more appropriate for the property and someone that's going to pay market rent. But one of the things you have to do is obviously do your research around how much is exactly net rent. And that requires you to talk to 3 different agents about what possibly you could get, what are the incentives you can get to entice the tenant, and then also moving forward, what you need to do in terms of, does a new tenant need a different fit out, what kind of compliance they need to go through, and any of those things that is going to put them into this property so they can start paying rent. So those are things to consider because that's the lag time. So when you do a tenant swap, the most important thing is time and the lag time in between putting a new tenant in and how much that's going to cost you. So that's important to define. So if that's going to be 3 months or 6 months, then you need to factor that into the cost. Now, sometimes just because the tenant is paying under market rent doesn't mean that the vendor is actually going to sell the property for a cheaper price. They might be still wanting to sell the property at $500,000, and let's say, for example, they want to sell the property for $500,000, but the net yield in the market or the cap rate in the market in that area may be 7%. So you should theoretically be getting somewhere around $35,000 for that property, but you're only getting $30,000 or you're only getting $25,000. But the vendor still wants to sell the property for $500,000 because he thinks it's worth $500,000. One of the things you can do by buying this property is that to work out what it is that is realistic for that type of property. So perhaps by putting in a new tenant, you might be able to actually get more than $35,000. So you might be able to get, $37,000, $38,000 or $40,000 for it by doing and making some cosmetic changes. But you do need to swap out this tenant, and the tenant usually might be there for a long, long time, because why wouldn't you be in a property as a tenant if you're paying under market rent? So it's really about you making the hard decisions. Very few people want to do that in this market, is to swap out a tenant. But the benefit of swapping out a tenant is that you actually have a better quality of tenant. You actually have longevity in that property. You actually bring more value to that property. So the number one thing is obviously research with the agents and finding out exactly how much per rate per square meter, finding out the incentives you need to give to the tenant. So there might be 3 months rent free, might be that you need to help them with fit out, it might be that you need to help them with paying some of the outgoings as they get set up. There might be a lag time of 3 months or 6 months as you get at the tenant. Your tenant currently might, and I'm talking about the tenants already in the property, might be on a short-term lease that expires in 6 months, or maybe on a month-to-month basis. If you are getting into this type of property, then it's better to have a tenant who has 6 or 9 months left on the lease, or already on month-to-month but have been there for 2 or 3 years, because that gives you some kind of stability to be able to perhaps finance the property. They give you some stability to say, look, the tenant's going to be there for a little while paying the rent while I figure everything else out. And it gives you a basis to work with. So you can go into the property, and also the second thing to look at is to look at the state of the property. So if the tenant's already there, then they may already have a basic fit out that is suitable. So if they're a warehouse, office or retail tenant, they may have basic fit outs. So they may have a grease trap in there, they may have partitions in there, they may have a mezzanine floor, things that you can already use. So the next step would be to find out the compliance of them. If they're already compliant with strata and also with council, then there's not much more you need to do about it, and all you need to do is really to make it look better for the next tenant. Then I would get some opinions, obviously, about how and what to attract. Have a look around at the neighbouring tenants to see who they are and what do they do, and how you could find a tenant that is suitable for this type of property. Also look at the vacancy rate around the area. So if there was very little vacancy, you swapping out a tenant or getting your current tenant to pay the market rent could be really simple, because it's just a matter of, if the area is in such demand, then there's upward pressure on the rent, so you could get much higher rent as well. So that's the other thing to think about, the number 3 things to think about. Now, as you progress with this transaction, obviously we're going to try to negotiate on price. So if the tenant's paying $25,000 or $30,000 and they should be paying $35,000, with the potential of getting a new tenant that could pay $38,000 or $40,000, then you don't want to be paying $500,000 for it, which, even if at the net yield of 7%, you means $35,000, you should be trying to negotiate maybe at $400 to $450, depending if the vendor wants to do the deal or not. But it's all comes down to the condition of your sale. So the stronger, when you're in this position trying to buy a property and you have to swap out tenant, the stronger the position you are, the better it is going to be in terms of you getting a deal that you are going to maximize your equity in the future. So swapping out a tenant, the main thing we talked about, and we're coming back to this, is about the lag time. So we need to define that lag time through your due diligence. That's the main thing you're doing through your due diligence, is work out the lag time. And you work this out through the advertising campaign. Typically takes 2 to 3 months if you're in a metro area. 6 months if you're in regional. If you're in a regional with a few more vacancies, you need to allow yourself 9 months. And if you're in a more rural area, you need to allow you 12 months to put a tenant in there. So I would only do this swap out of tenant if I'm in a metro area, for a metro property. So that's, if I'm in fringe Sydney or Sydney suburbia, Sydney metro, Melbourne suburbia, Brisbane, Queensland, metro areas such as Sunshine or Gold Coast, areas like that, I would look at swapping out a tenant. And of course, I'd be looking at an area that has very little vacancies. So when I look at that, I'll speak to the agent. So the agent might say, look, at the moment you're getting $90 a square meter, but you could get $120 a square meter. So I would do some research and go, okay, $120 a square meter, that's going to mean that, I get a 30% increase on my rent, which is good, which means that would directly translate to an increase in my equity as well. But what do I need to give, and how much would that cost me? So I might work out that it's going to take me 3 months to advertise. So there's some advertising costs, which might cost $5,000. There is leasing fees. So a new agent putting a new tenant in for 3 years will cost somewhere between 10 to 15% of the first year's rent. It may be inclusive or exclusive GST, depending on which agency you use. So that could be another 8 or 10 grand. So we're at 15 at the moment. If you then have to give the tenant another 3 months rent free or help them with incentives, it might be another $5,000. So all up is going to be 20 grand. And perhaps you've got also your holding costs. Once one tenant exits, the other tenant comes in. It potentially, you've got to pay your mortgage, you've got to pay some outgoings, you've got some miscellaneous fees in terms of tidying up that property. So that might cost you an extra $5,000. So $25,000 to swap over a tenant. So you've got to look at that. And one of the ways I look at it is to actually take that off the purchase price. So if it's a $500,000 property, I know they'll take $25,000 off it straight away, so that it becomes $475 as the maximum I would go to for that property. And then I would look at negotiating it down further, because ultimately, if I'm going to pay $500,000, I want this property, by the time I've done this exercise, is to be worth at least $50,000, if not $100,000 more, so 10 to 20% more during this swap over period. And look, for people who do this, and if you can do this buying a property with cash, then it is a really good strategy, because you can go in there, give them a lower offer, buy it out with cash, settle it, swap out the tenant, go to the bank, refinance, pull out the equity and do it again. And you could relatively move quite fast, and within sort of 6 month period, you could actually be doing 2 deals, which you already have really good substantial equity with. So that's one of the options. So remember the 3 things to look for if you're swapping out a tenant. Firstly, the time is the most important. Realistic market rent. So you want to know and talk to the agents about the realistic market rent you can rent out for. Number 3 is about the cost of holding the property. So work out the cost. So rent from not only from the tenant, but the incentives you need to give to the tenant, the leasing fees, any of your holding costs, work that out. So get those 3 things locked in, and then you're ready to negotiate on the deal. And during your due diligence period, when you've got the property under contract, the main thing you're going to be looking at is what do you need to do and what time frame you need to put it in if you need to do some cosmetic renovations to the property, and whether the property is already compliant for some of the basic things that is already there as well. So hopefully that's been really helpful if you're looking at that as a strategy for commercial property. Remember, always happy to discuss with you on any of the commercial property strategies. Reach out to me at helentarrant.com, and I look forward to helping you further. In the meantime, hit the bell and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye for now.